Hey. Many thanks to everybody here and to the Women's Foundation of Hong Kong, who have sponsored some of our excellent students like Kylie, who we heard from earlier, and for arranging my trip. It's such an honor to be here. The subject of my talk is broadly gender and technology, which is a special interest for us at the Center for Gender Studies. But I've chosen to talk particularly about artificial intelligence and how using gender as a category of analysis gives insight into the multifaceted ways in which culture, history, labor, political theory, and science fields are all related and imbricated in understanding the roots of gender inequality and technology. And since I'm an academic, there's a lot of citations in this, but I promise there's only one graph, okay? Only one graph. So I want to start by asking, why are there so many feminine representations of artificial intelligence and those that are manifest in our lives in computer technologies? And after that, I ask, what connections do we see in the history of gender and computing and its contemporary effects in artificial intelligence, algorithmic design, and what lessons we might draw? And of course, I've learned from many years of teaching that having lots of great pictures are a great way to keep your audience from falling asleep, like my about this. And so we know from Metropolis to Ava and Ex Machina, or Joy from Blade Runner, or Scarlett Johansson's voice on Her, and many other stories about this that I think is particularly exemplified from the character Anita from the show Humans, that oftentimes depictions of artificial intelligence in a popular culture are made by sort of personified women here, and Anita really exemplifies this. A pleasant, polite, domestic worker who cooks and cleans, looks after children, and can also be made to provide sexual services. And some of the most famous examples of this in kind of contemporary consumer technologies are these sort of digital personal assistants. From Cortana from Microsoft, who is derived from a heavily sexualized artificial intelligence construct, cloned brain of a female scientist in the Halo video game series. And virtual personal assistants are almost always female voices that can be said to reproduce forms of female servitude. So this is a really popular trope we have in culture. Another of our students in Cambridge Gender Studies, Carrie McCarrath, has recently published a paper linking this to feminist political theorist Nancy Fraser's concept of a crisis of care. So Fraser calls this crisis of care, or the care shortage, that's caused by the unceasing expansion of the so-called productive sphere and the subsequent impoverishment of the sphere of social reproduction, like childcare and elder care that we've heard so much of today. However, while Fraser observes the outsourcing of care work under the poor and or racialized others as one of the system's coping mechanisms, she doesn't examine another one of the key ways in which capitalism attempts to mitigate or resolve this kind of contradiction in technology. We also bring with it, in terms of representations, a kind of fantasy with automation of disembodied labor, of all the benefits of economic productivity without bodies that need care, food and rest and health care and recreation and connection and everything that we might say makes us human. And at the same time, cultural representations, and this is just a sample and one limited to mostly Hollywood films, also display images of artificial intelligence as femme fatales, sexy under a heterosexual male gaze, who have these awesome powers that escape control of the male makers. And so, from Metropolis to Ava and Ex Machina, or Rachel from Blade Runner, we have here a display of fears of hyperintelligence and skills in women with the threat of overturning the patriarchal order and overturning the rule of humans, sometimes appear to be one and the same thing. And I think one of the things that this does in these representations of technology and automation, artificial intelligence in popular culture does, is following Helen Hester's work, is really makes gender visible. So normally we don't see the kinds of automation and commodification of femininity in these caring technologies, but I think making the gender visible by embodying them in the figures of women can make this gender very visible here. So we have made an artificial woman perform the tasks associated with femininity, and a way that gives us a sort of space to reflect back on the supposed naturalness of women performing these devalued tasks, and perhaps provides us an opening as to whether they too can be considered fully human in this. So how have these cultural representations then been reproduced in history and in the labor market? And what are the assumptions about intelligence and who has it and who possesses it that are reproduced in real life as well? So one of the things we note from political theory is that intelligence is something that has come to be linked to ruling ethics, so that has become, there's a sort of justification in having and possessing power that comes from intelligence. It seems natural and ingrained to us. And this has reproduced this idea that the sort of these gender dichotomies, we would say, between skilled and unskilled labor, between rational and emotional, between male and female, civilized and primitive, and the ways in which all of these divisions are at work when we think about intelligence and the ways in which it can become automated or not. And this is reflected in history. There's a lot of really great work that's been done lately, and I'm just focusing on, kind of on history and the labor markets and computing in particular, but I want to focus on one book that I think gives us great insights from Marie Hicks and their book, Programmed Inequality. So people often assume that a gendered labor change, so when women disappear from a field because of a lack of interest, a lack of relevant skills, it's because of this lack of relevant skills, or it's because of an inability to get hired that plays a major role. But Hicks argues that neither of these explanations of individual choices or inadequate educations explain why women lost in computing. So taking the British case as an example, where women were heavily involved during the World War II in the development of wartime technologies and computing, how did they particularly in this time that computer operation and programming were viewed as women's work, and women were key in developing and code breaking. But by the 1960s, as computing gained prominence and influence, men had displaced the women who had been pioneers in this feminized field of endeavor, and the field acquired a masculine image. Now, of course, lots of labor historians have noted the tendency for work done by women to be classified as unskilled when women perform it, while it was considered skilled for men. Or similar takes men performing skilled work. And of course, the computing industry was no exception. And Hicks shows that the gendered labor organization was a key aspect of Britain's drive to computerize. And so as electronic computing technology improved, it became easier to use, women were no longer welcome in it. And underlying this was the assumptions that women's lives would be defined by heterosexuality in ways that would require them to leave the workplace, making work secondary to home, reproduction, and family. So women couldn't get promotions, and all the managers were men, and middle-class men at that. So computerization and the job categories that it created were intentionally and explicitly built around a particular mid-20th century sexual status quo, equation of womanhood with motherhood, and assumed dependency of women on males' wages and so forth. So because these technologies were deployed in the civil service in Britain as a centralizing technology designed to concentrate power, computing was necessarily antithetical to equal opportunity. And this is why, despite women's long experience working with and within the machinery of government, the field masculinized as the power of electronic computing became clear. So from this, we can look at and see that the low proportion of women CEOs in high technology fields, as elsewhere, is not a new issue, and it's not a coincidence. It's a legacy of structural discrimination and the persistent devaluation of women's abilities. And it also demonstrates that the use of women and others marginalized along race and class and nationality have been replaced by automation and historically in order to keep costs low. And we see here, I think, the patterns of underachievement and perceptions of women as less technically competent that persist in culture and business and higher education. And this image of incompetence is, in some ways, a recent historical construction. So it's not rooted in the natural evolution of fields, nor is it reflected in the skills that women demonstrate or their aptitudes or interests. So this is, again, images from Hicks's books here to see women, it's sort of the advertisements of the time in the 50s where women were as the computers. And you also see the ways in which this model of male managers and female sort of low-level technicians was also spread around as these technologies were sold throughout the world and overseas as well from this. As kind of exported as a model here. So I think using gender as a category of analysis can show how the absence of women has defined technical change and shaped key technologies. And one of the reasons in which this is something that we call a kind of myth of the genius, or myth of the white male genius in particular, that sees intelligence as something as innate. So there was a major article published in Science, this is a major scientific journal, that showed that it isn't so much that related to innate ability so much as it is about assumptions about abilities, what the authors of this piece described as ability beliefs. That concluded that across the academic spectrum, women are underrepresented in fields whose practitioners believe that raw innate talent, or genius, is the main requirement for success because women are stereotyped as not possessing such talent. And this hypothesis also extends to racialized minorities as well as other groups subject to certain stereotypes. And you can kind of see here, this is the only graph, as I said, where we have the sort of higher, or the more people think that you need to have just innate talent for it, that hard work isn't going to get you there, okay? That the higher percentage of PhDs, and this is based on American data that you have here, so fields, so this is sciences and social sciences and humanities here, so we have math and physics and engineering, computer science, sort of at the top here, philosophy, music competition, econ, and these as well as being particularly male-dominated fields, and there's this very close correlation between the two of them. So I think lack of women in these fields constitutes a form of structural bias that is really built into our sort of cultural assumptions about what intelligence is and who possesses it here. And this has a number of effects that are linked to algorithmic discrimination in terms of this. And this has been a topic that has gotten a lot of academic attention lately, and so I'm just going to talk about a little bit. So what are the effects of some of the structural bias in AI and computing and machine learning as well? What I mean by algorithmic discrimination here, or what Ruha Benjamin has recently called the new Jim Code about this, is that gender and racial biases in the algorithms that reproduce inequalities in race and gender, nationality, and more, and even embedding assumptions within them about gender and race that can reproduce certain forms of classification that are rooted in racial and gender essentialism around this. So I don't have time to get into sort of all of the vast implications about the use of algorithms by governments or social sciences or social services, police forces and tech companies, corporations, and making hiring decisions based on these. But this literature is vast. It's what Virginia Eubanks called a certain outsourcing of empathy, kind of sorts of decision-making this way. And the idea here is, in many cases, that algorithms are supposed to take out the human bias, and they're supposed to be neutral and objective. But what happens a lot is that a lot of forms of human bias become built into them, and they can make them invisible, can make them harder to see. And so it's harder to see some of the biases when you're sort of using them with technology. And so there's at least 3 sources of bias in artificial intelligence and algorithm use here. That the data is unrepresentative, and so who is not there is not generating data. And this is a case of something that Keys and Joy Bulawimi and Gebru noted on questions of gender and race in particular as one example. So their work demonstrates in their gender shade study, which shows that darker-skinned females were the most misclassified groups when it comes to facial recognition, with an error rate of up to 35%, in contrast to lighter-skinned men, for whom the maximum error rate was 0.8%. And of course, things like this lead to false positives and unwarranted searches. It can cause a threat to civil liberties. And some facial recognition services have been known to misidentify people of color and women and young people at high rates. And also, Key's noticed that this also has a sort of tendency to misidentify trans and gender non-binary or non-confirming people as well. And it can help to shield various vendors and law enforcement from making them accountable to the public for this. So there's other forms of discrimination include what Rachel Tapman found out. She's an academic in linguistics and found that Google's speech recognition software was 70% more likely to accurately recognize male speech than female speech. Or when speech recognition is used, for example, to transcribe notes from physicians, that error rates are not only high, but significantly higher for women's speech than for men. And this comes from not having enough women in the databases or not having enough people from different categories that are represented as well. But we also see forms that or ways in which different kinds of algorithms can reproduce forms of oppression. And this is something from Safiya Noble's book, and this is from Noble's book as well here. And she rather famously noted some years ago that Google's photo application had tagged African Americans as apes and animals. She's famously documented how a search for black girls would yield sexualized and even pornographic images on the first page that reinforces centuries of stereotypes and objectification and commodification. And searches for Asian girls fared similarly. And photo searches for doctors get images mainly of white men. Well, and so this is just kind of one thing that's one of the examples that she said that, sort of from this tweet here, that when you would Google unprofessional hairstyles, you would get mostly black natural types away. And this is, for her, a way in which that these sort of algorithms, again, that purport to be neutral, that can actually reproduce certain forms of oppression and certain histories of oppression. And so when we don't have people paying attention to this, we don't have people who know these histories, or that they're not, that they can seem to be neutral, but they can reinforce this. So when we think about some solutions to this, as many people had many discussions here, we not only need more voices at the table when we create technology and reducing leaky pipeline problems, but I don't think it's only about getting more women and girls interested in STEM subjects, although that's certainly part of it, because it's been shown that even when women and girls are graduating with degrees in science, technology, and engineering and maths, that they're less than half as likely to get job offers in those fields as well. So we not only need to address forms of structural bias and structural inequality here, but I think overall that more people, men and women and everyone in between in the social sciences and humanities, needs to sort of be able to train this information and their knowledge of the histories of gender and race into this and make these kinds of algorithms more accountable. So there's people who work in this field talk about the importance of grounding design and the use of data, like other technologies, and in listening and engaging and working with people who are most affected by these problems to develop an understanding of structural oppression and how different forms of AI and intelligence can be used to reproduce them, or can be used to make the algorithms better, to make them more gender neutral. So I will wrap things up there and say I think it's important here to make gender visible, and sometimes we can see that best in popular culture, but I think seeing the work that is being done to de-skill women and devalue the work that they do, whether it is in the formal productive workplace or if it is that kind of de-skilled work that we talk about in terms of caring labor as well. And we need to think about what assumptions about the human and who that is are when we are building and constructing machines at the same time. Thank you very much.